Hey Guy, today we'll explore the astonishing endurance of medieval farmers, people striving to survive the freezing nights, from the ever-lurking dangers around them to strategies like using warm blankets and communal sleeping to keep themselves warm, and the stories woven around that bitter cold. Listen to the entire tale, and if you enjoy it, please like, share, and follow the channel to hear even more great stories. Have you ever wondered how, on a winter's night in the mid-13th century, when the biting wind blew in from the ancient forest and swept over the straw roofs of those shabby huts, a medieval peasant managed to claim a warm and peaceful sleep? Let us travel back in time. Breathe in the icy air of the Normandy or Alsace regions, where vast fields lie blanketed in snow, and listen to the story of nights that seemed never-ending. From the moment the sun set, life in the village transformed. Along the hillside paths leading into the settlement, torches were lit. Their flickering flames danced against the stone walls, illuminating the muddy lanes. The guard dog's barks echoed like a warning. Night had fallen, and anything, or anyone, passing through would be scrutinised by the torchlight. But ever since people first built those little huts, wooden frames thatched with straw and walled with earth, they feared not only hunger and cold, but also the cruel tactics of the nighttime brigands, those who set barns ablaze, stole horses, and seized livestock. They also had to be wary of starving wolves whenever the snow grew deep, for prey in the forest had grown scarce, forcing the packs to come closer to where people lived. Right inside the peasant's hut, the battlefield of survival began. First, they had to build a fire, but not just any ordinary flame. It had to be a fire large enough, placed at the very centre of the room, on the packed earth floor. This was the family's soul fire, the place where everyone gathered to warm themselves, cook corn porridge, and fry sweet potato cakes. Fanning the flames was also an art. Bellows made from coarse cloth, lightly dampened with cold water, prevented ashes from rising while stirring up golden sparks that spread warmth throughout the house. The quality of the fire depended on the type of wood. Oak was dry and heavy, burned for a long time but released heat slowly. Ash was light, burned quickly but gave heat in fits and starts. The peasant learned to mix both, beginning with a few ash logs to get the blaze roaring fast, then gradually adding oak to maintain steady warmth. Above, the house's frame featured horizontal beams, both for hanging pots and as racks for curing salted pork, smoking fish, and even storing small sacks of flour. But the fire inside the house only solved half the problem, because the temperature outside could plummet to several degrees below zero, freezing the water in wooden pipes and hardening even the packed earth floor. That was when humanity's rudimentary technology came into play. Straw beds laid flush against the walls, next to the thick walls of earth mixed with lime. Above them, people layered dry leaves alternately, with heavy linen fabric to form an insulating curtain. These layers of cloth were often dyed with bark tannin for added warmth, and sewn together with sturdy leather stitches. When night fully descended, the crackling of the fire sounded like a beating heart. Before crawling under the covers, the whole family would share a handful of herbal salt, a mixture of salt with thyme, rosemary, and mugwort, placed under their pillows to ward off chills and repel insects. Some families made small pouches of coarse cloth, filled them with warmed roasted rice husks, then sewed them shut to serve as warming pillows, placed at the foot of the bed. Then, after the mistress quietly warned the children to keep still, the husband, usually the leader of the nightly watch, slipped into the alcove at the head of the room, holding a hooked iron staff to detect any unfamiliar shadow. He scanned every corner of the hut, listened for the wind howling outside the door, and only then felt secure enough to lie down on the straw pile. His gaze held a trace of sorrow. The sorrow of one who must bear his family's burdens in turbulent times, but also steely determination. In the dead of night, when snow began drifting against the small window, an unfamiliar sound might be the click of a wolf's claws on the ice. Some families took to tying short wooden sticks to the brim of their iron helmets so that, should an intruder slip in, The sticks would knock against the wooden floorboards with a loud clatter, rousing everyone. It was a rudimentary alarm system, yet astonishingly effective, in a place where the field across the trail was often visited by wolves and bandits. But there was another peril: smoke suffocation. Many thatched huts lacked a proper chimney, relying instead on a small vent in the roof. Smoke would pool inside, stinging the eyes and leaving the body aching. The peasants would furrow their brows and gasp for each precious breath of relatively clean air to cling to warmth. By morning, every household kept a handful of dried soap nuts, fruits that had been washed and sun-dried, to brush the soot from their hair and faces. When storm struck, hail and thunder added to the fury. Many would rise in the night to reinforce the thatch with sturdy rope slings. Iron hooks driven deep into the beams would secure the straw tightly to the rafters. If the storm proved too fierce and the roof began to tear away, the wind could lift the entire straw bed, waking everyone in terror. They would have only time to scramble into the central pit of the house, press themselves against the earthen wall, and cling to one another. But for medieval farmers, those dangers were only part of a long-term struggle for survival. They also had to think about food. During the long, frigid winter nights, the entire village rarely ventured into the fields to harvest. Instead, they had to rely on stored provisions. Potatoes, in southern Europe often beets or sweet potatoes, corn, and ground barley, kept in wooden barrels or wrapped in animal hides. Each afternoon they cooked a pot of thin porridge, adding a bit of pork fat or smoked meat, then divided it into small bowls to sip throughout the night to keep their bodies warm. The sound of spoon against bowl echoed in the otherwise silent night, like a lullaby. The elderly lay on their straw beds, moaning as their stiffened joints protested the cold. The children, eyes wide and bright, sometimes cried out when the chill seeped into their hands and feet. The mother would rise, reach toward the fire, scoop up more hot broth with a wooden ladle, and warm her child's hands by wrapping them in a heated cloth. Around riverside villages, peasants also faced the threat of river pirates. On moonlit nights, small boats would drift into side channels, eyeing barrels of salt and brine-filled jars of pickled vegetables. Once darkness fell, the pirates would silently pull ashore and begin looting. For this reason, many families built thorn fences along the banks and tied strips of cloth soaked in strong lime to them. As a warning, anyone daring to come ashore tonight would be greeted by the sting of lime. And when everything seemed stable, one night in the bleak winter of 1285, a blizzard struck with driving snow that lasted 3 days. The fishermen on the Loire froze to death, the salt-soaked corn set aside, spoiled and rotted, and half the village's pigs perished for lack of dried grass to feed on. Yet it was precisely in these dire circumstances that the bonds of the community were rekindled. The strong shared their wheat with needy neighbours, and a great fire was lit in the village square so everyone could gather, exchanging knowledge and techniques for staying warm. In that bone-chilling cold, the peasants learned a priceless lesson. Survival was not a solitary struggle, but one of unity, sharing, and learning from those who came before. Every lullaby, every tale told by the campfire held a secret. From the way to knot ropes for fastening carved stones on the mountain as snow braces, to how to fashion primitive shoes by gluing straw onto deer hide to keep the feet warm. Then, as the storm finally relented and the leaden sky began to yield to dawn's first light, the village emerged through a fragile veil of mist. Voices rang out cheerfully, calling neighbours to shovel the lanes, heat water for steam baths, rituals of rebirth after the night of merciless frost. The young hauled bundles of dry wood out to the fields and tossed them on the central fire, warming the whole village once more. When night blankets the village and the temperature continues to plunge, the secrets lurking in the darkness come alive once more. In this section, we will delve deeper into how medieval farmers coped with hidden dangers, from the urgent quest for fuel to the art of keeping the body warm, and finally to preventive measures against illness and caring for one another through the cold night. The art of finding fuel in the snowy forest. Did you know that in many small villages at the foot of the hills, wood gathering was an unofficial race. As soon as the snow began to fall, the men of the village would split up and go into the woods on what they called a sense hunt. That is, to sense which trees could be felled without being too damp, avoiding logs soaked through with mould from the rain and snow. At the crack of dawn, before the sun rose, they'd strike their axes against a tree trunk, listening for the thud-thud to gauge dryness. A muted thud meant the wood retained moisture, while a ringing echo meant the piece was dry enough to burn well. After returning the master's axe and a few sharpening stakes, they'd carry the logs to the collection yard near the village entrance. There, the guard post would set up horizontal beams as supports, lining the ground below with river stones so the wood wouldn't soak up moisture from the muddy earth. For each log stacked, they'd affix a small piece of parchment bearing the gatherer's name and the date brought in, so they'd know which wood to use first. By late afternoon, amid the dim hush of falling snow, the torch at the woodpile became the starting point for the journey home. Each man shouldered 2 bundles of wood on a wooden yoke, stepping slowly across the thin ice. The flames' flicker danced across the snow, casting distorted, elongated shadows with every step. They reminded themselves, carry for one day and the family won't freeze through the night. Tips for keeping the body warm from head to toe. In the little thatched house, the woman was the master of thermal techniques. They knew that to prevent the body from losing too much heat, they had to target and insulate the areas most prone to heat loss: the head, neck, hands and feet. Thus, before crawling into the straw pile, they would wrap a hand-woven woolen scarf around their head, sometimes treated with pine resin to block gusts of wind. Fur hats made from fox or otter pelts were considered the lifesaver on 20-degree nights. They fit snugly around the head, preventing cold air infiltration. The neck was wrapped with a thick strip of linen, into which a few sprigs of dried rosemary were sometimes tucked. As they moved, the scent of rosemary wafted around them, creating a sensation of warmth and easing tension. For the hands, they wore gloves woven from sheep's wool, with the palms further insulated by small pouches of hot embers. They would heat sawdust from rosewood until glowing red, place it into a little cloth bag, sew it shut, and slip it into the glove. This ember pouch kept the hands warm and radiated heat throughout the body. The feet lose heat most easily because of direct contact with the ground. Animal hide boots lined with dry straw were a common choice. Occasionally, a farmer would wear double-layer shoes, an outer layer of water-resistant buffalo hide, and an inner layer of soft, warm goat leather. Tiny iron studs in the soles prevented slipping on the ice. A few fortunate families even had boiled wood clogs, heavy but absolutely windproof. The battle against illness on a cold night. Amid the biting cold, disease spread as rapidly as mould on old firewood. Pneumonia, whooping cough, and the plague were constant fears for the farmers. They believed that if the hearth smoke wasn't properly vented, it would stagnate inside the hut and cause bronchitis. Thus, they bored additional smoke wells, small openings just above the ridge of the thatch roof, beside the main vent, to let the smoke escape more easily. They also placed a bowl of apple cider vinegar on the small altar in the corner of the house. According to folk belief, apple cider vinegar could purify the air. Each night when the owl's hoot signalled the midwinter hour, around 2-3 a.m, the head of household would lift the lid from the vinegar bowl, allowing the mild sour scent to diffuse, driving away bacteria and evil spirits. People rarely slept through the night in one stretch. They would sleep for about 2 hours, then wake to sit against the wall and warm themselves for 10 minutes before returning to sleep. This practice kept blood circulating evenly, prevented capillaries under the skin from clogging, and reduced the risk of frostbite and coughing up blood. The power of community and collective rituals. When the village bell rang hoarsely, signalling the watch hour, midnight, 2 or 3 families would gather under the canvas tent in the communal yard. There they would light a fire larger than usual, called the watch fire. The blaze roared, its red light spreading over the snow. Members inside the tent would braid strands of ash and rice husks into necklaces, believed to protect against evil spirits and disease-carrying insects. Seated around the watchfire, one person would recount the story of the great snow deluge from the year before. when snow fell for 5 days straight, burying the cowsheds and driving the pigs to starve to death. Another would share their grandparents' advice. If your fingers showed signs of turning bluish, you must immediately soak them in warm water with a high salt concentration, then massage them with herbal oil to prevent gangrene. Laughter, sighs of relief, and the scent of burning wood mingled together, making the cold outside feel less frightening. Prayer and faith to warm the spirit. In the quiet of the night, when every hut lay silent, many peasants chose to pray or recite brief chants to keep their spirits warm. The Catholics would softly sing hymns like Ave Maria or recite the Creed, the melodies echoing gently through the darkness. Those less devout would repeat proverbs such as "Cold is the winter night, but warm is the human heart," a reminder that no matter how bitter the chill, fervour and hope always provide warmth. Some wanderers, seasonal labourers from the high mountains, even erected makeshift shelters outside the pigsty, for the heat emanating from the pigs served as living hearth. They would curl up on old sanitary pads, swap ghost stories about spirits herding pigs back into the forest, and then steal a few minutes of sleep before the cold snapped them awake once more. Deep into the cold night, when the north wind swept through the gaunt trees, the harshest realities of medieval life began to emerge. In this section, we will follow a small peasant family, the Klaus household, to witness firsthand the bloody clashes with ravenous wolves, the terrifying ambushes by border bandits, and the merciless hunger that devoured their stored provisions. Imagine yourself sitting by the hearth, hearing every crackle of the smoke as I tell this tale, so you can more vividly grasp what survival meant on a rural winter's night. The night of the wolf's howl, battle by torchlight. It was a late December evening, the snow already 1/2 metre deep. The Klaus family, Father Jakob, Mother Marta, and their 3 children had just finished dividing bowls of sweet potato porridge when a chilling howl rang out. The entire household fell silent. Jakob bent to stoke the fire with fresh coals, but the faint flame still could not banish the biting cold. Marta, busy wrapping a wool blanket around the youngest child, watched anxiously through the small window. Wolves, the terror of every farm in winter, had gathered by the barn wall. They moved in packs, probing through gaps in the crude wooden boards. The crunch of snow under their claws was enough to make Jacob strain his ears. Silently he prayed, "May Mother Sky bless our peaceful home," then calmly carried his oil lamp into the yard and thrust the village's great torch aloft. The flickering blaze swayed, sweeping along the thorny fence. The pack of wolves staggered across the white field, their eyes glinting with cold menace. One leapt forward, its fur glistening with dew, then let out a howl that urged the others onward. Jacob did not hesitate. He shouted, brandished the torch, then stepped back toward Marta so his wife could grab the earthenware jar filled with damp earth mixed with salt, a stinging blend they believed could repel wild beasts. Marta dashed forward and flung the jar at the lead wolf, sending up a cloud of choking dust. The acrid smoke forced the pack to retreat, but one smaller wolf, its coat grey-white like the snow, refused to back down. It lunged forward, nose twitching, then charged straight for the neighbouring sheep pen. Marta screamed and pulled their eldest child into the pigsty for safety. Jakob seized his long oak spear and raised it in the torchlight. The wolf charged, its sharp fangs bared, but this time it stumbled on a cleverly hidden spike of wood set outside the fence. Its body flew aside, and the rest of the pack snarled before turning and fleeing into the darkness. The Klaus family exhaled in relief. Jakob's chest still bore the scratch of a passing fang, but the lives of their sheep and piglets had been preserved. Marta held the youngest close, quietly recalling the folk saying, "If you dare to stand alone in the night, let the torch be your companion in life." This had been the 3rd time that winter Jakob had risked freezing sweat to protect his livelihood. Border bandits, the enemy in human form. Not only did wolves run rampant, but the bandit gangs grew bolder in the cold season too. These bloodthirsty wanderers stashed small swords in their belts and hid beneath coarse cloth aprons to slip past the border guards. One night, as Jakob was keeping watch over the woodpile in the yard, he spotted a strange shadow weaving through the pine forest on the far hillside. He pressed his lips to a dried snail shell horn and blew a warning call, alerting the villagers. The horn's blast echoed across the snowy fields, and torches throughout the village flared to life, their red glow clustering like fireflies. The bandits suddenly froze. Stepping out of the darkness, their gaunt faces were revealed, eyes alight with hunger, not for gold or jewels but for food, rice, and the plump livestock they coveted. The bandit leader, a tall man wearing a rusty iron mask, raised his hand in a signal. His followers immediately knelt and opened their sacks, revealing a few hardened loaves of bread and some old dried beans. They begged for a bowl of hot porridge, for they were starving to the point of collapse. Marta glanced down at the jar of grain, torn between sharing it and keeping it for her own littlest ones. Jakob ground his teeth. If we give it to them now, they'll come back next time, and won't bother to ask. In the end, he agreed on one condition. The bandits must spare the barns and leave the border at once. When they received the steaming bowl of corn porridge, Jakob barked, "Be gone by dawn, or else." The bandits clumsily took the bowl and slunk away into the night. The next morning, the villagers inspected the barns. Not a single sheep missing, not one pig taken. Yet Jakob knew that mercy only brought a temporary reprieve. This brutal winter would drive the bandits back, more ruthless than before. It was a painful lesson in the fine line between compassion and resolve. The famine of 1315, when provisions turned to gold. In the memories of the village elders, the winter of 1315 was the Great Famine. Snow arrived early, drizzling rains persisted, the fields flooded, and crops withered and died. Never before had the Klaus family's granary shriveled so badly. By mid-January, the rice in their jar was barely enough to cook 2 small bowls of porridge for the entire family each day. Marta skillfully traded a few torn dresses for some kernels of corn from the neighbouring household, then stewed them into soup with dried tomato skins. Their eldest child, 7-year-old Hans, had to roll up his sleeves and wade into the fields to gather beets, scrubbing away slime and lime dust before cooking them into the broth. The whole village urged one another, share each spoonful of corn so that no one perishes before spring. But by the end of January, the Huber village's corn reserves, just 3 miles away, had also run dry. Rumours spread like wildfire of peasants forced to eat animal hides, even boiling dry straw baskets in exchange for a pinch of salt. An elderly couple in the far corner of the village was found dead, curled beneath their bed. Their graves had to be dug at midnight. No one dared bury them by day for fear that the foul corpses would trigger an epidemic. When Jakob went down to the town to trade some animal hides for rice, he returned with reddened eyes because the price was 8 times the usual. A few others from distant areas brought pickled turnips and smoked kohlrabi in exchange for a few torches to light their way home. The entire village pooled what remained into a single communal midday meal. A great pot of soup set in the square, everyone scrambling for chunks of bread as hard as stone. But just at the moment of utter desperation, a solitary friar appeared. He carried bread from the nearby monastery and a sermon on compassion. God is still with those who endure. He distributed portions to each household, urging them to save a little for the next day. The friar's arrival was like the final torch, illuminating a path for the villagers to hold fast through the famine. A song of hope for the dawn. When the snow began to melt and the weak rays of spring sunlight appeared, patches of green wild grass emerged along the old trail. Jakob and Marta led the children onto the muddy path as it transformed into a field of new grass. Everyone joined hands and sang the ancient song. Snow melts and it grows warm. Hearts grow warm as well. Tomorrow the spring flowers will bloom again. Their voices echoed across the hillside, driving away the darkness that had clung to them for months. Life is inherently fragile, yet those small souls leaned on one another, vanquished the wolf packs, stood up to the bandits, and endured the cruel famine. They carried the torch of compassion to light their way, yet even then they had to steel themselves to survive. When the thick layer of snow had completely melted and the ground lay damp like a piece of coarse cloth squeezed hard, Klaus village awoke to the sweet air of spring. Morning dew still clung to the blades of grass, and gentle dawnlight filtered through the ancient oak canopies. This was the sacred moment that the medieval farmer had awaited through the bitter months. When the earth stirred awake, new life sprang forth from its depths, and the struggle for survival began anew in a transformed guise. Beginning with the traditional plough. As soon as the church bell tolled 4 times, signalling plough hour, Jacob and several of the village youths harnessed their strong ox to the plough. They observed the old ritual. Before the steel blade sank into the soil, Marta scattered a few grains of ginger-soaked barley upon the furrow, as a vow to the earth god that they would protect the crop. The small clapper's ring and the scent of ginger-fermented grain mingled in the air, driving away dampness and consecrating the field. The ox advanced, its rough forged steel share carving neat trenches in the soil. Clods of mud splattered against Jacob's shins, yet he followed barefoot, feeling the earth's warmth beneath him. Each step produced a steady thud-thud rhythm, a peaceful cadence amid the hard work. Around him neighbours hurried, some dug side channels, others spread stable manure, a mixture of horse droppings, straw, and hearth ash to loosen the soil. The battle with mud and drizzle. Spring in northern Europe was not always gentle. Weeks of drizzling rain turned the furrows into thick mire. Ploughs clogged and oxen trudged laboriously. Jacob had to use an iron hoe to scrape away the packed mud, sometimes stooping for an hour under the cold rain. His linen tunic soaked through and stained black with clay, but no one complained. They knew, if they failed to till and sow in time, the summer sun and wind would strike before the seeds could take root. At midday, when the rain eased, Marta swiftly laid salted pork in the hearth oven, sautéing it with a handful of onions and pickled carrots. The warm steam and the aroma of pork fat beckoned everyone inside to gather around the rough-hewn wooden table. The axe block's thud against the knife glinted silver, a brief respite amid labour. Children played collecting stray barley grains, helping their mothers while strong men taught them folk songs of spring. The sowing ritual and faith in abundance. That afternoon, with the furrows ready, the village elder, usually a man over 50, carried the seed sack ahead, scattering barley evenly along the trench. His footsteps on the tiles clicked like a prayer with each step. Mother Earth, receive these seeds, let the shoots reach toward the sun. The villagers followed, casting handfuls of peas and oats, reserving a final lucky seed to place under the straw mattress on the first night's bed to protect the family from hunger and frost. By custom, Marta then took a small container of canola seeds and tossed them lightly into the air before sowing, to prevent birds from feasting. Once sprouted, the canola would form an oil barrier around the field, repelling fruit flies and poisonous spiders. This technique, passed down from their ancestors, bore the marks of early agricultural science in medieval life, confronting pests and small beasts. Just days after sowing, the young beds showed field mouse tracks and cracked rice weevil shells. The cabbage and root gardens had tender green clusters, but tiny larvae emerged from the mud. Jacob and Marta chased mice with bamboo nets and set small wooden traps to snare them. Against the insects, they used a folk remedy. They crushed fresh mugwort leaves, extracted the juice, mixed it with hearth ash, and applied it to the new leaves with a brush. The pungent mugwort scent was enough to drive the larvae away. Meanwhile, the hum of bees was equally vital. Beehives placed around the canola fields ensured pollination, but swarms could overwhelm workers. Marta would carefully puff light smoke from the hearth into the hive to coax the bees elsewhere, safeguarding the crop and avoiding stings. Sleeping beside the livestock, a living hearth. At night, with the ground still damp and temperatures low, many families moved part of their straw pile into the henhouse or ox stable. That space became a haven of warmth. The animals' body heat, the gentle jingling of their collars, and the glow of burning dried canola husks. Jacob spread a cooled, dry linen cloth under the straw and lay down to sleep. Marta placed a small warming bottle, made of goat hide filled with glowing ash, at his feet, then softly sang the lullaby, Fields of Dream, to soothe him. Sleeping among the livestock was a shrewd survival tactic. It deterred thieves and harnessed the animals' body warmth. However, one had to choose a spot carefully, away from bedding and droppings, to avoid dampness and toxic gases. Yet in keeping with traditional belief, the night's herbal smoke, from mugwort and summer savoury, was burned to keep the air pure and safe. Listen, my friend, when the barley shoots break through the earth, and it seems all hardships are behind them, in truth the journey has only just begun. Sit with me now, lean against the dry oak trunk, breathe in the warm spring breeze, and let me continue to tell you how the medieval farmer had to face the scorching summer sun, the first drought and unexpected thunderstorms, and then the bubbling joy of the Mother Earth Thanksgiving festival, the scorching early summer sun, the challenge of drought. Have you noticed that when the morning mist lifts, the sun's rays begin to pierce strongly through the leaves? That is the signal that the soil has dried, and the tender shoots need water more than ever. The Klaus family had to organise immediately. Jakob and the young men of the village laid bamboo irrigation channels from the spring up to the fields. They dug furrows along the field's edge, then fitted each bamboo segment together, bound tightly with woven thorn vine, so that water would flow gently into each sowing ridge. But the spring stream dwindled. Its flow grew as thin as a hair, with some reaches running dry. Imagine at midday under the blazing sun, they knelt in the mud, scooping bucket after bucket of water, with wooden ladles as if measuring time, each dip precious as nectar. Marta ran back and forth to the village well, hauling pails of fresh water, her hands salted by sweat, yet still softly singing. Sweet spring water warms the heart, pray for rain to soothe the soil. Then, on the third day of drought, the sky turned a solid bronze, not a cloud in sight. Some of the young shoots began to wither, their leaves curling like fingernails. At that moment, the village elder advised a folk remedy. Mix ash from the nightly watchfire with water infused with dried guava and sprinkle it around the rice stalks so the earth would retain moisture longer. The process may seem backwards, but imagine this. The ash holds moisture, and the pectin in dried guava creates a thin film around the roots to trap humidity. The villagers ended up with grey-stained hands and laughed at each other's muddy smudges, but the effect was miraculous. The young shoots straightened and grew strong again, reaching for the sun. The sudden thunderstorm, the art of defence. Just when they thought their worries were over, the sky suddenly darkened, thunder rolling like war drums. A thunderstorm plunged the fields into flickering downpours, knocking the canola blossoms downward and flinging seeds from the furrows. Jakob called out, "Quick, unfurl the protective net!" A large piece of coarse linen, big enough for 4 people to hold, had been prepared in advance. Each corner was tied to wooden stakes and drawn across the young field. Under the torrent, they pulled the cloth taut. Raindrops gathered into heavy beads that dripped rhythmically over the edges. Can you picture Marta and the village girls, heads wrapped in cloth, arms, swinging constantly, voices raised in the old verse? Storms return to the sky above. Taming the hills, we greet them with a smile. After the storm passed, the sun shone again through the lingering droplets, casting a delicate rainbow. The fields revived. The young leaves stood upright once more, and everyone understood. Having weathered the storm together, their bonds were all the stronger. The Mother Earth Thanksgiving Festival. Then came the festival night, the day the whole village solemnly offered thanks to the Earth God. Beforehand, Marta and the other women ventured into the woods to gather bay leaves, hibiscus blossoms, and fresh mugwort, weaving them into warm leaf wreaths to hang around the necks of those treading the fields at harvest time. The men prepared platters of spit-roasted pork and boiled, plucked chickens, alongside crisp, toasted slices of bread. When the sun set, the central bonfire in the village square blazed bright. The elder lifted a cow horn and blew 3 long calls, then stepped into the circle of villagers. The beat of drums and the clatter of clappers urged everyone on. He began the ritual, sprinkling fragrant toasted flour onto the flames, then tilting the offering tray so that the fire licked at the grain. The faint scent of burning flour drifted upward, like a heartfelt thanksgiving to the earth. The people raised their heads to the sky and whispered, "Mother Earth, grant us rain and sun enough. Fill our rice stalks with grain, and our granaries with beans." Afterward, beeswax lanterns were lit, and led to the village's small chapel. There they ate, sang, and told ancestral tales of years when rain and wind were in harmony, of the great snow flood of last year, and of hopes for an abundant harvest. Laughter rang out, goblets clinked, and the warm aroma of beeswax filled the air. Do you see how, in those solemn yet warm moments, their faith in nature's cycles was strengthened? They knew that whether by drought or storm, as long as their spirits remained steadfast and they stood together, the crops would blossom and bear fruit. Preparing for the first harvest. When the drums signalled the end of the festival, the Klaus family called one another to rest. Yet Jacob and Marta were already dreaming of the barley harvest. They planned to take their newly sharpened sickles into the bamboo groves at the hill's base, fashioning sturdy handles from aged bamboo. Their beaded protective caps woven from rice husks were set aside to guard against a glancing blade. "My friend, at dawn, the village children will shout, 'First harvest, first harvest,' as the villagers formed two neat lines, some with sickles, others with baskets ready, to begin a day of collective labour. Though weary, they will keep their joyful smiles, for it is the reward of so many months of hardship." When the first morning rays gently lifted the mist, the barley fields had already turned a glowing gold. Today was the day of the very first harvest, after so many months of tending the young shoots. Now they swayed like a ripe sea of grain. Imagine yourself standing among those bending stalks, hearing the steady snick-snick of sickles, smelling dry straw and the faint yeast-sweet scent of grain in the air. This was the farmer's triumphant song of victory. The snick of the sickle and the rhythm of the harvest. Jacob gave the signal with the small wooden clapper, and the whole village split into teams of 2 or 3. In each team, one person cut, another gathered the sheaves, and a third tied them into bundles. As the sharp blade swept through the ears of barley, the snick-snick rang out proudly like war drums. A child stood by, clapping at each tied sheaf, eager for the little piece of bread tucked in their cloth pouch as a reward. The work proceeded briskly, but without haste. The cutter held each sheaf neatly at the base and made a clean cut. The gatherer carefully placed the sheaves into a bamboo basket. The binder wrapped pre-twisted thorn vine tightly around the middle of each bundle to secure it. Sweat beaded on foreheads, linen tunics soaked through, yet every eye sparkled with joy. They sang together the folk song. "Fields of gold yield fragrant wine. Our hands join in the grain belt's line." The midday meal, among the fields, fuel for the working body. By noon, Marta had prepared a large pot of soup made from pork fat, pickled turnips and a handful of dried millet. Each team sat on a patch of green grass, baskets of grain serving as makeshift pillows. Steam rose in curling plumes, the warmth cutting through the lingering chill of the morning. Everyone competed to ladle each spoonful of broth, tearing off crusts of the hard bread to chew between sips. During the break, Jacob turned to the young man beside him and recounted last year's lesson. If it weren't for that guava ash trick to retain moisture, the barley would have wilted in the drought. The youth nodded. Indeed, because of that the village still had rice to make porridge for children and the elderly. This meal was more than sustenance. It was a chance to share knowledge and strengthen team spirit. Battles with mice, pigeons, and field thieves at harvest. Piled sheaves and sweet aromas naturally attracted field mice and pigeons. As the sun climbed higher, mice crept from the field edges, slipping through gaps between the stalks. Marta and the girls wielded bamboo nets and wicker trays, swinging them with a rhythmic thud-thud across the plot. Startled mice scattered, some trapped in the nets. White pigeons descended onto the stacks, pecking away. The villagers blew 3 long blasts on the dried snail shell whistle, its echoes sweeping across the field. The flocks of pigeons broke and flew off, just as Jacob ran Hayim to chase off a trio of grain thieves, men disguised in ragged clothes trying to steal bundles to sell. The cry of "Thieves! Thieves on me!" rose up, and the fluttering flags and shouts sent the rogues fleeing in panic. The storehouse hour tradition and the soot ritual. As the afternoon sun waned, the villagers quickly burned the leftover soot from winter and spread it in a thin layer across the storehouse floor. This custom, called the storehouse hour, protected the barley before it was racked for drying. Ash absorbed moisture and prevented mould. The village elder intoned, "Ash of the old year, keep this year's grain strong." Then the sheaves were moved into the wooden granary, where straw carvings marked them as the first harvest. Inside, dim beeswax candles illuminated the wooden plaques carved with the harvest year. Rows of grain stood in lines so the ash's aroma could drift through, keeping the space dry. Marta placed a pouch of dried bay leaves in the corner. Legend said they repelled pests and drove away mice, joy and concern. Before the rainy season, with the first harvest safely stored, the village gathered before the communal hall. They exchanged seed varieties, discussed the next crop and prepared for late summer storms. Jacob turned to Marta, grasping her hand. "At this rate, we'll have enough rice to feed the whole village through next spring." Marta smiled, her eyes shining. "And we've learned so many lessons from every trial. Whether storm or drought, we stand firm." The autumn sun cast its honeyed glow over the rotting thatch, and the cool breeze slipped through the gaps in the walls, carrying the sweet scent of dry straw. Klaus village entered a new phase. No more bare feet trudging in mud, or oxen hooves dragging ploughs, but the hand-cranked grain mill, the smoky hearth of the drying oven, and storerooms full of cloth sacks bursting with lentils and golden millet. In these days, each morning upon waking, one stepped into the time of milling and storage, when village life beat in time with the turning millstone and the rattling grain bins. Dawn's ember glow and the grain mill. At first light, when the sun reddened the granary floor, Jacob and Marta sprinkled dry ash around the base of the grain mill. The ash did more than ward off moisture, it kept the kernels from moulding as they were crushed. The steady thump of the wooden pestle against the mill's lid sounded like the breath of the entire village. Young men took turns bending their backs, pouring hulled barley into the mill's mouth, then inhaling a steady puff of hearth smoke to stave off fatigue. When the grains cracked open, white dust floated up. They swept it swiftly into wooden channels that led the rice into coarse cloth sacks, the backyard grinder and the hearth oven. In the courtyard behind the house, the women gathered around a small wooden hand mill. Mia, the eldest daughter, skillfully loaded lentils and millet, turned the crank, then scooped fine flour-like meal into bowls for cakes. The slices of millet cake sizzled on the black cast-iron pan, filling the air with the warm, nutty aroma of grain, pure energy for the coming cold winds. The steaming cake's fragrance spread through the house, making even the field mice that prowled the storeroom turn green with envy. Smoking fish and curing meat. While the grinding continued, Marta tended the smoking oven for fish and dried meat. She hung small river fish under the eaves, leaving a gap for smoke drawn up by a handmade flue. The fire smouldered gently to burn off moisture in the fish, turning their skin a deep golden hue and releasing a heady aroma. Meanwhile, Jacob mixed herbal salt, sea salt blended with thyme, mugwort and dried orange peel, and rubbed it into thin slices of pork. Once smoked, the meat was cut into squares, packed in earthenware jars, and occasionally turned so the smoky fragrance penetrated every layer. The communal noon feast. By midday, the communal hearth beside the village hall blazed. A pot of newly milled sticky rice steamed headily. It was formed into cakes fried over glowing coals and drizzled with honey. The clatter of wooden ladles stirring the batter mingled with lively chatter. The elders sat in a corner of the yard, scooping warm millet porridge into wooden bowls, adding a few strips of dried meat, then chewing thoughtfully, almost as if they were swallowing the season itself. They retold memories of bitter winter nights and last year's famine to remind the younger generation to cherish every grain and every drop of water. Tool-making by the riverside woods. In the late afternoon, when the slanted sun illuminated the hanging bamboo irrigation channels, Jacob and some of the village youths headed to the riverside woodpile. They used cleavers to cut the selected logs from spring, then honed them into knives, hoes, and small axes. Each tool's edge was tested by chopping a hard bamboo stub. If it sliced as cleanly as a razor, it passed. The village's veteran carpenter, who had crafted the first mills, supervised, pointing out tiny cracks that needed to be filled with resin and ash mortar. When each tool was finished, its handle was wrapped with coarse thorn vine for grip, ensuring no slip, even when hands were sweaty. Nighttime workshop and grain record ledger. After dark, the leftover milled wood was brought into the makeshift workshop beneath the granary roof. Flickering lantern light glinted off fresh glue and polished wood. Marta sat nearby, cutting goat hide pieces into small sacks for seed storage, sewing on wooden pegs so they could be hung. These leather pouches, once used only for firewood at the door, now held millet flour and next season's seed grain, safe from nibbling rodents. At the room's centre stood the village elders' small writing desk, where they recorded daily weather, temperatures, and warming tips. Today Jacob added a new line. Prepare 20 more guava ash pouches for the mill base, and enlarge the granary's vent to prevent mould. Those scrawled notes were precious luggage, passed down from generation to generation. Bedtime rituals. Before climbing into their straw loft, Marta placed a small ceramic jar on a shelf, filled with autumn-harvested rosemary and dried licorice leaf essence. Its gentle fragrance dispelled any lingering smoky dampness. The elders stashed millet pouches beneath their pillows, believing the seed's warmth fortified sleep and brought luck. The children hugged their straw pillows, drifting off to the distant rhythm of the millstone. Their lullaby in this serene close of early autumn. And so the first days of autumn ended quietly, leaving every medieval farmer with a sense of abundance and faith. They had turned the harvest into a season of milling, processing, and preparing for the chill to come. In the next chapter, we will follow the journey of pepper, salt, and grain to the nearest market fair, where Jacob will sell the surplus to earn a few coins for warm cloth and lamp oil. Pause now, inhale the fresh scent of new rice, feel the silky grain of millet flour between your fingers, and prepare for the mercantile voyage ahead. You know, when the late autumn sun slanted through the shutter cracks of the grain store, Jacob was always ready to take his surplus to the market fair. His steps felt heavy under the strain of the bulging sacks of pristine white barley and the bundles of golden millet tucked beneath coarse linen. Before he set out, Marta gently tightened his belt and handed him the brass flask of rosemary-scented water, so that in the market, a single gentle breath of fragrance could banish the dust and hearth smoke. Together with several neighbouring families, Jacob walked the winding dirt road toward the market centre. By then the leaves had turned a deep crimson, drifting down to blanket the path. A cool breeze stirred the dry leaves into dancing flutters like golden butterflies, setting hearts alight. Passers-by greeted one another, wishing you prosperous trading, and Jacob replied with a bright smile. That day's fair bustled more than usual, for everyone was stocking up for the coming winter. You would see stalls piled with pickled turnips, jars of pale yellow kimchi, and strings of smoked pork hanging overhead. Buyers and sellers haggled animatedly. I'll take a measure of this barley in exchange for 4 small woolen cloths. Jacob carefully counted handfuls of grain, placed them on the iron balance beam, and kept his eyes on the thickly woven silks of every colour. Throughout the market, brokers prowled like hawks. They tapped Jacob on the shoulder and whispered, "They're offering more on the other side." Jacob frowned slightly and forced himself to stay calm. He glanced toward Marta, waiting at the corner with her small basket of squash and dried carrots, and signalled, "Hold the price. We only want cloth and lamp oil." The negotiation was smooth, but Jakob knew, as long as they secured enough warm wool and economised every drop of oil, they would survive the bitter nights. Did you notice the market floor was covered in dry sand? It was to prevent slipping when the snow falls and to wick moisture from wet boots. When Jakob reached the oil stall, he saw the price had doubled since last season. The vendor, an elderly woman with silver hair, wiped sweat from her brow and murmured, "The flax crop failed this year, so oil is scarce." Jakob remained silent, then offered a small pouch of old coins along with a handful of barley. She smiled softly and nodded. "That's enough. Grind it fine and burn it for warmth." Marta's gift basket was traded just as deftly. A few sacks of lentils for several rolls of heavy linen, some dried squash for a small vegetable knife. Each item was chosen with care, for they all understood. In sudden blizzards, a dull blade or thin cloth could turn an already harsh night into a fight for survival. On the way home, Jakob and the others paused beneath an ancient oak. He lit his small pipe and nibbled on a piece of dried meat. The mingling warmth and smoke drove away the chill. They chatted spiritedly about plans for a new granary, how to ration lamp oil, and shared tips for kindling fires quickly in freezing winds. These talks were more than commerce. They were lifelines of shared knowledge. When darkness fell, the group returned to the village, shoulders heavy with necessities. That night, in the Klaus kitchen, Marta kindled a flickering fire in the cosy room. Jakob placed the sacks of grain on the loft shelf, breathed in the sweet scent of fresh barley, and clasped his wife's hand. My friend, in that moment they knew, however severe the winter, with savvy buying, clever trading, and prudent saving, the warmth of community would light every heart. When the wind howled outside, they had fire enough for warmth, cloth thick enough to keep out the cold, and faith large enough to hear their children's peals of laughter around the straw beds, cuddled safe in peaceful sleep. Have you ever wondered what medieval villagers feared most on those late autumn nights, when mist filled every alley and their torches guttered and sighed? It wasn't only the flesh-cutting cold or the famished mice raiding the granary. They lived in dread of the plague, in terror of witches' spectres, and even at the sudden knock of tax collectors or the Lord's enforcers. Let me tell you about those fears, for they were carved into every peasant's heart as an ever-present warning. Fear of the Black Death. When rumours of plague reached the neighbouring hamlet, just as the autumn sun was losing strength, dead rats began appearing under floorboards, and a few hens fell sick and died. One morning Jakob discovered his neighbour Hilda gone overnight, her skin mottled like oak bark, her eyes rolled back in her head. Word spread like wildfire. Stay away from the sick, do not tend them, or you will catch it too. Coarse cloth drapes sealed windows, bundles of herbs burned endlessly, yet nothing could banish the terror. People kept their distance. Even husband and wife slept on separate straw pallets, never whispering, only praying silently through the folds of fabric. Fear of witches and demons. Darkness held another dread. Witches and demons. When an owl's hoot echoed from the nearby wood, children would tremble, pressing small hands to their mother's chest. Everyone believed it portended a cursed soul. Some families swore to place a carved stone talisman by their door to ward off evil, or sprinkle salt water infused with rosemary at every window to block malevolent winds. Marta once recounted seeing the figure of a woman stumbling through the mist clutching a small leather pouch. People whispered she was the spirit guide, come to seize the soul of one lost in the forest. Ever since, no one dared leave home after supper. They avoided nighttime trips outdoors, instead squatting in a pit latrine beneath the house, breathing only in hushed tones, as if to avoid waking the night itself. Fear of the Lord's agents. No less fearful was the local Lord's power and his soldiers. Every few weeks, the Count's tax collectors would ride into the village on war horses, flaunting their authority, demanding livestock, land tithes, and grain levies. The thunder of hooves on the common green set guard dogs barking furiously. Jakob witnessed armoured men pounding mace butts on the chests of those who hadn't summoned the village council, then hauling them onto horses like sacks of grain to be dealt with in the town square. Villagers wept as their animals were bound, their granaries overturned, and their fence gates torn down. Fear of nighttime sorcerers. Then there were the peddlers of curses, charlatan sorcerers who under cover of darkness would bind spirits or divine who was guilty. They carried parchments scrawled with uncanny runes and set up grotesque altars in the dead of night. When their deep drums began, all other sounds fell silent. It was said that one must tremble or shed tears during the rite, or one's soul would be bound, one's livestock die, and next season's crop fail. So, at the sound of the midnight clapper, Jacob and Marta rushed to light extra beeswax candles, hang laurel wreaths, and attend the soul-calling ceremony. Refusing was unthinkable for fear of the curse. Fear of utter solitude. Yet the greatest fear lay in the invisible void, loneliness in the dark. When doors were bolted and only one flickering flame remained, they heard the wind creaking through the boards, as though someone knocked. Jakob and Marta said nothing, only gripped each other's hands, each breath visibly steaming, telling themselves, it's only the wood expanding, the smoke dancing. But in their hearts they both knew, open the door just a crack, and darkness would pour in with 1,000 strange shapes, enough to shatter the strongest spirit. Fear of death itself, and finally the fear of death, the dread that they might never see spring again. When someone in the village died during the last frost, they dared not bury the body by day for fear wolves would dig it up. At night, beneath a canopy of stars, they held a simple rite under the old oak, torches and incense to ward off scavengers, the corpse placed on a raised wooden bier. No one wept aloud. Instead they sang hymns or murmured short prayers. In those moments the whole village faced life's fragility together, praying that the departed soul might witness the next harvest. Through these tales you see, medieval fears were not only of tangible dangers, but also of unseen terrors that crept into every breath and etched themselves on the heart. Yet in each moment of terror, they found solace in faith, in solidarity, and in ancestral rituals. That was the warm flame of humanity shining through endless night, sustaining them until the promise of dawn. Imagine a late winter evening, when the snow falls so thickly it erases even the familiar trail. In the flickering torchlight, each hut hovers like a dark eye, and a new fear drifts through the storm. The faint moan of someone calling for help. Open the door, and you risk dragging bone-chilling cold inside. Leave it closed, and the desperate figure outside may collapse in the white drifts, blocking the way for the firewood horse you so urgently need. Fear of the blizzard. When swirling winds whip snow into a white vortex that blots out the horizon, the farmer strains to catch any word from the next village. Night watchers mark trees with ribboned markers or carve notches on trunks. Some families drive long bamboo stakes at the yard's edge, so a lost traveller can feel their way home. Yet in the heart of the storm, every sign vanishes, leaving only nature's roar, and a trembling heart that wonders, is there anyone still alive out there? Fear of the roof. Collapsing thatched huts with slender wooden frames sometimes buckle under the frozen weight. Jakob once heard the sickening crack of a beam giving way, then watched half the roof collapse onto the granary corner, burying a small bin of grain and his freshly repaired sickle. Since then, every household props extra bamboo poles under the rafters and presses bundles of dry wood against the roof so that thawing snow drains away instead of piling up in one spot. Fear of the stranger's footsteps. When the storm abates, an eerie silence follows, broken only by the crunch of our familiar footsteps. In blizzards, drifters slip into the cowshed or henhouse to wait out the cold, then steal copper pots, dried mushrooms, or leftover tubers. Farmers hear the wheels squeal on ice and ask themselves, is it a thief or a pack of wolves? Many nights Jakob and Marta keep vigil, stoking the hearth and flinging handfuls of stinging salt ash to drive off both poachers and predators. fear of the fire dying. Yet the deepest dread of any medieval winter night was the flame going out. Fire brings warmth and banishes every terror. When a gust slips through a crack and the flame sputters and dies, the fire tender must dash outside to seize a damp log and relight the hearth. In that flickering instant, darkness surges in and the heart trembles. Can I spark the fire again? If not, dozens of villagers, old and young, women and children, must remain awake, desperately striving to rekindle the only living flame. In those long, freezing nights, fear of losing the fire drove them to keep dry wood bundles beside their straw pallet and to preserve hot embers year-round in clay jars. They knew that a single spark could warm the family, cook a bowl of corn porridge, and sustain the hope of dawn. Pause now. Breathe deeply. Imagine yourself wrapped in a woolen scarf beside the hearth, listening to the snow against the eaves. When you're ready, we will continue with the final part of this chapter, the closing songs of autumn, when the blizzard subsides, embers still glow, and the farmer's heart looks forward to a new turning in the coming spring. There is another silent terror that returns with winter, the dread of thin ice on rivers and ponds. When temperatures stay below 0 degrees for days on end, the water's surface forms a sheet of clear ice, seemingly as solid as a mirror reflecting the sky. But a single crack, or a patch of running water, is enough to shatter that thin ice, swallowing up the feet of anyone stepping even lightly. Imagine this. Jakob must cross the river every week to haul in dry firewood, because when storms rage, wood in the forest grows ever scarcer. On the makeshift plank bridge, he can smell the faint thawing ice, hear the water whispering beneath the frozen sheet. Each footfall must be feather light, arms clutching the bundle of wood, eyes fixed on the spiderweb cracks creeping outward. Once, by a moment's carelessness, his boot slipping on a thin patch, he heard a sharp crack and felt his leg plunge into frigid water. The first sensation was an icy sting, like needles along his thigh. Then the sudden loss of balance and his body being swept along by the swirling current. In that instant, Jakob managed only one deep gasp, sensing his hand go numb with cold, before grasping a floating splinter of wood. Fortunately, Marta stood on the opposite bank. She screamed and flung him her thick woolen coat. He hauled himself out, drenched from head to toe, trembling so violently he could barely move. All that night, they took turns stoking the fire, pressing each other's limbs to their bellies, praying that warmth would return to their blood. From that day on, whenever Jakob ventures to the riverbank, he ties a small bell made from a brass cartridge casing around his neck. The bell's jingle alerts everyone whenever the ice cracks beneath his feet, giving them time to rush to his aid. No one in the village dares to set foot on the frozen river alone, and each morning at dawn they test the ice's thickness, tapping it with a bamboo pole, trusting only the firm thunk to signal safety. The cold seeps through the skin, but the fear of being plunged beneath that icy flow is far more horrifying. It isn't just the risk of death, but the thought of leaving one's family in darkness, frozen in silence, waiting until spring for someone to find them. That is why the terror of thin ice has become one of the most haunting memories for every medieval farmer. They revere the water, yet remain ever cautious and in awe of nature's silent, hidden power. Have you ever wondered what threats those narrow thatched walls face beyond the forces of nature? When the late autumn wind sends leaves swirling, bands of rogue soldiers slip along the trails, stalking the farthest huts. They are no chivalrous knights but mercenaries eking out a living by their sword arms, shovels slung over their shoulders, their eyes calculating. By day they hide beneath the forest canopy. At night they creep into ox and cow sheds, driving off livestock and leaving behind wreckage and despair for the farmer's wife and children. That danger grows sharper in winter. When snow blankets the roads and every grain cart returns to the capital, these freebooters choose that moment to strike. Jakob recalls one biting wind evening when the soldiers blocked the village entrance with thorny pine branches, then appeared wielding 3 long spear pikes. They tore open the villagers' grain sacks, forced Jakob to carry 1 sack on each shoulder, and bound a strange talisman to his arm to ensure no one dared resist. Their eyes glinted with merciless coldness, as if they intended to draw out the last warmth from the farmer's body. But it's not only plunderers. Towns larger than 10 miles away often serve as refuge for deserting soldiers. They masquerade as merchants, laden with cloth and spices, carrying kettles of hot tea, only to pull blades and demand half your wares under cover of darkness. The market, once a place of trade for survival, becomes a minefield of greed and fear. Wild beasts from the deep forest add to the threat too. Giant brown bears, once wary of fire, grow bolder when hunger drives them near the village edge. One night, Jakob heard the sound of slats breaking on the pigsty door and a low, jagged growl. He rushed out, brandishing his iron spear with heart pounding, and found a massive bear caught in a crude wooden snare. Beside it lay a half-eaten slab of pork, proof it had ventured onto the yard in search of food. The danger doesn't stop there. The hidden forest trails are lined with traps set by freelance hunters. They bury looped thorn vine snares so delicately that a careless step triggers steel-sharp jaws on your leg. Jakob nearly slipped once on a puddle, only to feel his boot caught fast. Blood trickled from his ankle in the freezing air. Marta raced over and cut the vine away, but the fear of being left trapped in the dark woods still haunts him every time dusk falls. And finally, the greatest threat of all. Even if the thatched walls hold firm, rumours of the central magistrate strike terror into every heart. Royal envoys from the Lord's Manor patrol the countryside with harsh statutes in hand, raiding each house to levy illegal taxes, fining those whose pigs stray from their pens, or who keep more fowl than allowed. At the clip-clop of their horses on the cobbles, the whole village holds its breath, dreading the loss of their precious salt, or the little jars of herbal remedy for coughs. Families wake in the dead of night to the thud of doors being burst open and the silhouettes of clerks rifling through chests, making meticulous records, and robbing them of sleep for nights on end. You see, the perils from outside are not only beasts or spirits, but humans themselves. Men who stake their survival on violence and draconian law. Yet through endless seasons, the medieval farmers stand their ground. They build thorn fences together, share news, and watch with suspicion every stranger's first glance. In the coldest darkness, they still clasp one another's hands, swearing no force, be it forest bear or royal magistrate, will steal the last warmth of their hearth. When you're ready, we will close this chapter with a song of unity, reminding us that it is human bond that stands as the strongest bulwark against all danger. You see, when dangers from outside assailed them all at once, biting snow tearing apart their barns, thin ice lurking beneath every footstep, rogue soldiers skulking along the hillsides, wild bears prowling, and the harsh edicts of the magistrate. The impact went far beyond material loss. They sowed deep insecurity, forcing the farmers to alter their way of life and reinforce bonds they thought already unbreakable. First, fear of bears and bandits made every household tighten its guard. Instead of letting livestock roam freely in backyard pens, they moved stalls close together, built thorn fences around the entire compound, and drove boundary stakes marking where their land ended and the forest began. These fences served not just as protection, but as a shared rhythm of life. At night, if one household spotted unfamiliar tracks, the alarm bell would ring, and the news would spread to the last cottage. What began as a matter of survival soon became true neighbourliness. Young people learned to watch over the elders' herds, and couples took turns using the communal mortar and pestle so one family could fetch firewood for another. Next, the menace of thin ice changed how goods travelled to market. Farmers no longer travelled alone. They formed groups, carrying poles to test ice thickness and passing by the warning bells placed along the riverbank. This extra caution drove up transport costs, since every load of firewood or seed grain required more hands and time to ensure safety. In return, the brokers, those posing as merchants, lost the chance to exploit lone travellers, and market prices grew more transparent. No one dared squeeze a desperate buyer when their very survival was at stake. Visits from the magistrate brought tax pressure that forced farmers to postpone plans to improve their fields and instead pool their reserves of gold and grain to pay levies. Many families had to share their stored food simply to make it to the tax deadline before thinking of buying warm cloth or lamp oil. Interestingly, as tax tensions mounted, the villagers met more frequently and formed a civil council, a trusted delegation to negotiate with the magistrate for fairer taxes or delay payments until after the harvest. Over time, their community organisation sharpened, paving the way for early forms of self-rule. But perhaps the most profound change lay in their beliefs and rituals. Facing horrors on all sides, from secretive witches sowing curses to sudden raids by the magistrate, farmers began blending traditional rites with new tricks. They added sprigs of eucalyptus, favoured by forest hunters for repelling wild beasts, to their offerings for the earth god. Then wove mistletoe branches, said to draw out evil spirits, into their laurel wreaths. These experimental practices quickly spread throughout the region, becoming each village's unique folk creed. And finally, it was those very threats that ignited a fierce longing, the desire for a safe, warm refuge, where no matter how dark the night, a steady flame would burn, where neither black magic nor tyrannical power could extinguish human compassion. From that fear, medieval farmers wove a network of mutual support, sharing firewood, trading cloth, and helping one another in dire times. They kept the secret of fire starting close, guarded the design of their smoke vents, and whispered prayers to the earth god to summon peace. It stands as proof that, within every fear, a steadfast will to live thrives, an urge to connect and overcome trials together, so that after each storm, dawn shines just as bright. Have you ever heard the sigh of the earth before the final winter gale? Around the village the world seems silent, only the soft hiss of embers and breaths muffled in woolen scarves. But in every farmer's mind the threats still lurk day and night, invisible yet heavy on their slender shoulders. By day they smile and nod greetings, but in their hearts the memory of blizzard nights returns whenever they close their eyes. In an instant the storm can erase the path to the cattle pen. They clutch the cracked wooden wall, hearts pounding. Some nights, jolted awake by nightmares, they find themselves sliding on an ice floe, plunging into ink-black water, thrashing in vain. They carry the dread of hunger, not just the ache in their stomachs, but the hollow cry that echoes through the night. Children wailing from starvation, pigs panicking in their pens for fresh water, the rustle of empty millet sacks. Entering the granary, they bow their heads and whisper, "Enough for 3 more days. Hopefully." A single failed crop, and that 3 days vanishes, letting the darkness of hunger seep into every corner. Many hide their fear of plague by avoiding all contact, shrinking from a comforting hand, glancing away in case a bruise on an arm signals the Black Death. They know that if one family falls ill, the whole hamlet must sever ties, fasten their doors with bamboo spikes, lock the sick away in a separate room until the soul leaves the body. During trade, the tax collector's visit is not just a black-robed spectre, but a nightmare of injustice. They fear him so much they bury coins under the floor, hide grain at the bottom of jars, even swapping out kernels to pay the exact amount. At night, when the magistrate sleeps nearby, they slip a hand through a crack in the wooden wall, checking the joinery, afraid that the cold breath of the official who passed this way will return, demanding more. Wolves, wild bears, bandits, plague, thin ice, blizzards, taxes. These dangers intertwine in the mind like thorny vines. When they light a torch in the yard, the flames cast flickering shapes of strangers in the mist. When they stir the embers in the hearth, the smoke outlines skeletal hands across the doorway. They wonder, will there ever be a night when I can lay my head on the pillow without fear? Yet amid these haunting thoughts, another whisper never ceases. I must keep the fire burning. They safeguard glowing embers, tuck a pinch of herbal salt beneath their pillows, carry a scrap of thorn-vine cloth as a charm, and hold fast to the belief that tomorrow will be brighter. An old neighbour woman murmurs before she sleeps, You don't need to dream of dawn, just believe you're still breathing. That fragile hope is stronger than any fear. It makes a trembling hand scoop hot soup on a freezing night, keeps eyes fixed on the snow-covered trail, and sustains the lullaby's steady rhythm. Even the darkest night surrenders to a single spark, and you see within every medieval farmer's heart lies the interplay of dread and hope, two halves inseparable. They live by fear, but they survive by faith. When you're ready, we will continue with the tale of how they turn that faith into action, forging a resilient community that rises above all dangers. You know, when their fears still linger in every hidden corner of the mind, medieval farmers spring into action to preserve their lives. They don't sit and wait for the blizzard or the mercenaries' raid. They plan each step in advance, stockpiling food, firewood, and lamp oil, honing their guard skills, sharing knowledge, and weaving a network of mutual protection. First, supplies. They don't just hoard grain. They pack salt, pickled turnips, and smoked meat into earthenware jars, storing them on beds of dried guava ash in their granaries. Every household keeps a small wooden tablet. How many jars remain? How many used? When must we open the reserve? Buffer for the worst snowstorm. This lets them know exactly how long they can survive in the fiercest cold without having to leave the village in search of food. Next, fire and flame, the heart of survival. Each family reserves a corner of the cattle shed to keep a buried pot of red glowing embers smouldering in a clay jar. When needed, they scoop them out to revive their hearth fire. By every door stands a small shovel and a bundle of dry straw, so that in darkness, a single spark struck against a steel flint bar can ignite a blaze instantly. An elderly couple in the village even invented an eternal flame box, a block of dried reeds soaked in flaxseed oil that burns steadily day and night without ever dying out. Then, community, the guiding star of mutual support. When Jakob learns a blizzard is approaching, he doesn't merely chop wood for his own family. He joins young men at the village hall to build thornwood barricades, hang linen windbreaks, and string alarm bells throughout the neighbourhood. Whenever a bell rings, everyone brings extra firewood, salt, and oil to the hall, less out of obligation than a silent pact. You help me today and I'll help you tomorrow. Guard rotations. No one stands watch alone. Pairs of villagers carry torches in relay to patrol the pens and grain stores. The teens hold the flames aloft while the elders watch from the shadows, teaching them to distinguish wolf tracks from human footprints by depth and pattern. Negotiating survival. Jakob once invited those mercenary soldiers into the hall, offering several small jars of barley in exchange for a promise not to raid the pens. After several such meetings, relations stabilised. The soldiers helped clear snow and ice from roofs in return for a handful of grain, transforming them from foes into the village's outer guard. Belief and ritual. Every bitter night before falling asleep, Marta and the village women tuck sprigs of rosemary and mugwort into the wall timbers. They light beeswax candles on the home altar to ward off evil spirits and keep a comforting glow alive. Some experienced families even hang mistletoe leaves in silk pouches above their beds, believing the fragrant sprigs will drive away any snowstorm witch who might pass. Finally, indomitable. Spirit. At first light, Jakob and his companions shoulder spades and hoes to reinforce the thorn fence, clear snow around the cattle stalls to prevent collapse, and inspect every grain jar. Though their legs feel stiff with cold and their hands numb, they press on, each step a reaffirmation that life can outlast the darkness for their families and all the villagers. This is how medieval farmers found the path to survival, rising from fear and weaving it into concrete actions, stockpiling, tending fire, sharing, patrolling, negotiating, and keeping ritual, day by day, hour by hour, proving that life will always triumph over the night. When you're ready, we'll continue into the next chapter, where hope for spring stirs once more amid embers and snow. Have you ever lain down at night and wondered what they used to shelter their fragile bodies against the biting cold? For the medieval farmer, sleep wasn't just rest. It was a silent battle against flesh-freezing chill. Let's explore what, on those endless winter nights, they actually slept on to stay warm and safe. The straw mattress. Each household first spread a rough linen sheet over the beaten earth floor, then piled on a layer of dry straw about a hand's width thick. They gathered young straw from the previous harvest, thoroughly sun-dried to prevent mould, then mixed in coarser thorn straw for extra resilience. When you lay on it, the straw whispered and rustled like a comforting fire, and its accumulated warmth radiated upward through the night. Layered quilts. Above the straw they wrapped themselves in multiple blankets. The innermost layer was usually thin linen to wick away sweat, followed by a thicker sheep wool covering, and then a layer of coarse cloth soaked in lime water to repel moisture. These quilts were often patchworks of old woolen garments and leftover fabric scraps. Within the patches they sewed small pockets filled with dried guava straw, its gentle scent adding warmth and driving off insects. The fur topper. In wealthier homes, the topmost layer was a tanned animal hide, fox, otter, or smaller bear, split thin and turned so the fur faced inward. The hide not only retained heat, but also felt luxuriously soft, like nature's embrace. You could smell the faint tang of wild boar hide, mingling with the hearth's breath, washing away every worry, from wind-rattled shutters to prowling mice. Bed placement and insulation. Beds were always set against the thickest wall, or up against the livestock stall, places where the earth retained more warmth. The exposed ground by draughty doorways was lined with stones or gravel to hold in heat. Beneath the mattress, they sometimes laid a bed of dry leaves, often mugwort or corn husks, for grip and to keep the straw from sliding. Each morning they'd shake out the leaf layer to release trapped moisture, then turn the covers so the straw dried out quickly. Pillows of husk and herbs. For head and neck support, they sewed small pillows from coarse cloth and filled them with peanut husks or rice chaff. These were heavier than modern feather pillows, but pressing them to the nape felt like a surge of warmth, banishing any numbness. Sometimes they tucked a few sprigs of dried rosemary under the pillow, its soothing aroma lulling them into peaceful dreams, devoid of howling wind or lurking wolves. The bedside torch. Finally, before closing their eyes, the head of the household would light a small torch and set it beside the bed. Its flickering glow danced across the walls, creating a pillar of light so that no phantom shadows could overtake them. They believed that as long as a single spark burned through the night, any lost spirit or witch's ghost would keep its distance. And so, wrapped in those thick quilts, hugging the warm chaff pillow, listening to the occasional crackle of the embers by the hearth, the medieval farmer could finally relax, breathing evenly into a sleep earned by survival and filled with gratitude for the dawn ahead. Imagine the moment dawn breaks and the whole village hums like a beehive. Everyone shoulders a specific responsibility, knowing that if a single link fails, the chain of survival will instantly wobble. This is the art of task division, not just to get work done, but to bind every member into one life-saving machine, wood gathering team. While the first weak rays of sunlight still filter through the trees, Jacob and a band of young men gather at the woodpile near the forest. Their job is the moisture check patrol, finding logs dry enough to split. Each man shoulders a bundle of oak and a bundle of ash, then stacks them neatly in the corner of the barn. They whisper tips to each other. Light grain patterns mean the wood is freshly dry, dark streaks still hold moisture. And thanks to this clear assignment, 2 hours in the morning yields enough firewood for the entire day. Water supply detail. At the same moment Marta leads the women's group around the village well. They lower a rope to the bottom, haul up a wooden pail filled with cool morning water, then carefully check water levels in the jars. They pour extra into the brass flasks to take to market in exchange for salt. This hydro duty ensures there's water for cooking, washing, and brewing herbal cough remedies. Granary overseers. In the village centre, the elder and 2 seasoned matrons inspect the food stores. They record each jar of corn, each pot of lentils, every sack of millet, and every box of herbal salt. spot a chuck nearly empty. They immediately activate the reserve, opening the winter store and rationing out 2 small portions to each household, so no one family's stock runs out first. At the same time, they coordinate with the carpenters to repair shelving and sprinkle guava ash on the tile floor to keep moisture at bay. Fire tenders in training. Children and teens earn the hearthwatch role. At dawn, they carry rotting kindling to the ember pot, stoking the fire to warm the elders. At midday, they scoop sweet potato broth into wooden bowls for the main field crew's lunch. Though small, their tasks are vital. 1 minute's delay could scorch the porridge or let the fire die in a gust of wind. Perimeter guard. At midday, a perimeter patrol of Jacob Neodamadeus and several other strong lads inspect the thorn fences and riverbank warning bells. They listen for wolf tracks, probe each patch of ice on the river, and check the trail markers on the stakes. They rotate shifts every 2 hours. 2 keep watch by day and 2 rest, so at night there are always 2 alert guards and 2 backup sleepers. Herbal medicine circle. We mustn't forget the apothecary team, the women versed in herbs. They scour the nearby woods for mugwort, rosemary, and savoury, dry them and pack them into small bundles. When someone coughs or their joints ache from the cold, they brew herbal teas and rub warming oil on the hadaneho, sore spots. Each afternoon they also inspect the chimneys, clear out soot, and ensure smoke doesn't linger indoors, protecting everyone's lungs. Evening council. At day's end, all the teams convene in the village hall. Each leader reports remaining stocks of wood, water, and food, and updates on defence preparations. The elder then adjusts assignments. If winter's fallen trees have cut the wood supply in half, the wood gathering team scales back, and the women pause their herb foraging to help carry logs. Conversely, if the granary is overflowing, the herbalists may camp farther out to gather rarer remedies. You see, task division here is never rigid. It flexes with real conditions, weather, reserves, external threats. Everyone understands that if they fulfill their role, not only will they survive individually, but the whole community will stand strong. And in that shared purpose, they find their greatest comfort. No matter what trials arrive, they have each other, breathing and stepping in unison, holding fast to warmth and hope through the longest winter. Have you ever wondered what enemies a medieval farmer truly faced in a battle during a raging blizzard? They didn't don gleaming armour, but fought from the very moment they stepped outside their door, battling flesh-freezing wind, keeping watch to ward off ravenous wolves, and burning with indignation at the echo of a raider's sword from the forest edge. The Great War, with the elements. The first and fiercest battle was always against the weather itself. Snow so heavy they had to break through drifts with each step, their breath freezing on their collars, limbs numbing like pricked needles. They learned to fashion a thermal shield from quilted coats, 2 layers of lime-washed linen on the outside, with sheep's wool and goat hide sandwiched inside, an armour of warmth that blocked biting gusts. When the cold gale squeezed through every crack, they huddled together and stoked smouldering embers, forging a wall of shared body heat no wind could penetrate. The wolf pack's wild wolves were implacable foes. They crept from the darkness, snow-flecked fur shimmering, eyes glowing like coals. Each night a rotation of sentinels scanned the shadows through narrow windows or smoke holes, ready to ring a copper alarm bell at the first sign of a strange track. The perimeter was reinforced with natural thorn barriers, and every iron spear and oak pike was sharpened to deliver a fatal wound. When the howl of wolves swept across the fields, torchlight flared like a line of war beacons, and Jacob, transformed into a fierce black wolf himself, rushed out to defend the fragile livestock. The bandit raids. But the most terrifying enemies were not beasts, but men. Border brigands who prowled at night, their swords flashing in torchlight, binding farmers so quickly they barely had time to resist. They blocked the road and threatened wives and children, demanding grain be surrendered on the spot. Farmers resorted to cunning, feigning weakness against a tree trunk, then hurling a clay pot filled with stinging guava ash into the bandits' faces. Using bundles of rosemary and mugwort tucked into linen screens, they unleashed thick herbal smoke beneath the dark sky, forcing the raiders to stagger back into the night. The plague. The Black Death. Meanwhile, the plague, the Black Death, descended like an unseen reaper. When a household showed signs of infection, the healthy among them, regardless of kinship, sealed off the sick, dug a pit to contain the stench, and left bowls of grain and porridge at the door, pushing them away from the walls. They mocked their fear by brewing epidemic teas of dried lemon peel, cinnamon and flax seeds, passing the recipes from hand to hand like talismans. Some families lost loved ones, yet those who survived thanks to the herbal remedy handed down the secret through generations. The tax collector, the magistrate's raid, tax soldiers in rusted armour were no less formidable. They arrived for their 3-day levy, demanding guides into the granary and horses to carry away the tribute. To counter this, villagers devised the phantom granary. They filled the real storehouse with barely enough grain to appear compliant, then led the magistrate's men to a secondary shed filled only with ash and straw. They promised more after the next harvest, then quietly carried the true reserves and buried them in the communal mortar pit. The battle within, finally the greatest fight of all, was against their own minds, those sleepless nights when panic peaked. Jakob once caught his own trembling reflection in the torchlight, his heart pounding as if it might stop. Marta gently laid a hand on his shoulder and whispered a story of a past spring's triumph, singing the folk refrain, "Fields of gold yield fragrant wine," to reclaim his wavering courage. Each whispered verse was their sharpest blade, severing the cords of anxiety and guiding them into a brief, restorative sleep, an elixir of the spirit strong enough that come morning, they were ready to rejoin the fray. You see, these battles, with blizzards, wild beasts, raiders, plague, taxes and inner terror, left no carved stones behind. But they forged an invisible armour around the community. With every trial faced, they tempered their resilience and added to the shared legacy of survival, an unbowed spirit. When the night closes in, remember that it was in these small, determined hearts that the flame of victory over darkness burned brightest. Have you noticed that after each fierce battle with blizzards and wild beasts, when the night's fury finally cools, the village awakens to very different sounds? The children's giggles, the gentle crackle of still warm embers, and hushed conversations as families share hard-won lessons. That is the moment they shift from fight to rebirth, taking a first collective breath and turning their thoughts toward the future. The next morning, when Jacob and the young men go out to inspect the thorn fences, they don't merely patch wind-torn gaps, they also gather broken pine branches to use as firewood. It's proof they know how to make use of every gift from nature, even in the wreckage. At the same time, Marta and the other mothers scatter dried canola husks around the chicken coop, both to repel flies and lend a comforting aroma, then discuss ways to improve their meat smoking techniques so the smoked pork will keep longer. At the village hall, the elder opens his notebook and jots down new entries on safe ice thickness and days' worth of firewood needed per patrol. Those hurried lines form a survival map that each generation enriches, sharpening the community's collective defences. And you know, in those scrawled notes beats an enduring pride in the farmer's self-reliance. Equally important, they care for the environment to prevent repeat disasters. Pools of standing water in the village lowlands are filled in to keep thin ice from forming. Hollow tree stumps are marked so no one stumbles leading a horse, and the path to the spring is reinforced with river stones to stop erosion. Each small task becomes an invisible fence, lifting everyone's quality of life and reducing risk while winter still holds sway. Then, when the last stars wink out behind the tree line, the farmer returns to his thatched home, wraps himself in straw and animal hide blankets, and closes his eyes, dreaming of a brighter future. In those dreams he sees children's smiles, hears the distant chime of the church bell, and breathes in the scent of mugwort and rosemary, the very magic that warms their souls. My friend, this is how they rebirth themselves after harsh battles, not only by enduring, but by skillfully nurturing the world around them, so that each passing winter becomes another confident step into spring, where new challenges await. Spring floods, the peanut planting, and the dazzling revival of fields bursting with flowers. Keep this vision in your heart, for it is living proof of the invisible strength of a small community in a vast world. Have you heard the roar of water sweeping away fresh mud after those long spring rains? That's the early flood season arriving, bringing fertile silt, but also the fear of sudden deluge. A medieval farmer did not dread the rising water because they had cunning plans. Digging small canals around their fields, driving sturdy bamboo stakes to guide the flow, and using woven bamboo funnels to channel water into storage ponds. Each morning, Marta and the women's group wade into the irrigation ditches with wooden scoops, dredging out accumulated silt. They nod in approval at each other's clever trick for clearing algae, sprinkling a few sun-dried mulberry leaves to kill off the slime so water runs clear. Along the bank, children quietly drop small strips of lime-soaked cloth into the stream, believing the lime will reduce bacteria and keep the water fresh for the young crops. Meanwhile, the band of strong lads, Jacob and Neodamides, trudge out to the newly deposited floodplain, levelling the ground and forming raised beds. They measure each furrow carefully, creating trenches for planting peanuts, a spring crop that naturally fixes nitrogen in the soil. When Jacob folds his arms and instructs, you can almost hear him lower his voice. Seeds must be spaced exactly a hand's breadth apart so the roots can spread and hold moisture. They gently press each seed into the damp earth, then pat the soil lightly with their feet, as if singing a lullaby to wake the sprouts. As the sun climbs higher, the canal water shimmers like scattered jewels across the field. Marta lifts her scoop, breathes in deeply the sweet scent of the silt. That is the promise of a bountiful harvest. But when thirst for water grows, they do not rush to fill the fields. Marta reminds everyone, leave 2/3 in the reservoir ponds, the flow will rise. That cautious warning shields them from the flash flood they'll face the very next afternoon. Sure enough, by late afternoon the river swells without warning. The upper channel thunders downstream, gouging away the makeshift embankment. At the crack of collapsing earth, the village mobilises its young men to jam river stones and broken tiles into the weakened dike. Their clay-caked hands cheer each other on. Hold firm, the wall will save us. When the water reaches just a fist's height below the crest, the village drum thunders an alarm. Everyone must gather, ready to move livestock and seed jars up to the high ground near the water shrine. Amid that chaos, a small miracle occurs. The herbalists discover dried lotus branches in the reserve jars and drop them into basins of water to repel mosquitoes, inevitably bred by standing water, so the elders and children escape fever. Their quiet laughter at that moment reminds us, when nature strikes, it is folk wisdom and mutual aid that keep the flood from becoming a catastrophe. Night falls and the waters recede, exposing the gleaming black silt, flats. Beneath the pale moon, Jacob and Marta stand on the riverbank, eyes on the purple phoenix flowers just beginning to bud. They whisper softly, "These peanuts will root deeply in this soil. Come autumn, the vines will climb high and the fields will be lush and green." And there you have the strongest proof. No matter how many floods or storms pass, so long as they prepare wisely and act together, medieval farmers will always sow hope. When the first peanut sprouts broke through the damp soil, the whole field burst into new life. On that day, the village women gathered around the young rows, deftly pulling weeds that crowded the furrows. They gently stroked the tender leaves. Legend said that if dry debris clung to the stems, the seedlings would suffocate. Marta mashed a bundle of sour-tasting canebrake grass, growing along the field edge, mixed it with diluted guava ash, and poured it around the peanut bases. The pungent aroma helped loosen the earth and drove pests to the surface, allowing the young plants to stand tall without strain. The field was not only the lush green of peanut vines, but also the brilliant red of plum and apricot blossoms lining the paths. Children, dressed in their patched dresses, carried small flower branches, brushing aside each blade of grass to guide the fertilizer-spreading plough team. The manure, composted since winter and stored in earthen jars, now gave off a sweet scent, promising that the peanuts would swell full and taste rich and creamy when the late summer harvest arrived. But it was at that same moment that the peanut borers, tiny white grubs hiding under the leaves, began to appear. The young men quickly fashioned traps, a strip of lime-soaked cloth wrapped around a stake, so that any grub crawling past would become stuck. Some said the lime's sting choked them, knocking them to the ground. Marta meanwhile took a small bowl of mugwort apple cider spray and misted it over the leaf surfaces at dusk, causing the grubs to tumble onto the dry sand beside the rows. And what of the sparrows and pigeons? When peanut pods first appeared, flocks descended to peck at the young kernels. The villagers erected colourful fabric banners, dyed with wood ash and shell pigment, to flutter in the breeze and confuse the birds' eyes. At dawn, the sharp blasts of a dried shell whistle rang out along the furrow edges, startling the birds into panicked flight. That warning dance, passed from mother flocks to their young, served as an invisible screen protecting the crop. Each afternoon, golden rays slanted through the leaves. They dug small holes at the ends of each bed, allowing irrigation water to seep evenly and preventing waterlogging that would rot the peanut roots. Jakob, now master of irrigation, carried his well water scoop, carefully pouring water into each trench in turn, his movements as graceful as a field dance. He cautioned, "If you pour too quickly, the current will wash the seeds out of the furrow, and they'll freeze in the cool of the day. Try closing your eyes and imagine it. The gentle scent of silt blending with lime, and the mugwort tang, soft whispers trading knowledge, and the steady flap of banners in the wind. That is the springtime music of the farmers, as they awaken Mother Earth's potential and tend each young shoot with heart and skillful hands. At day's end, under the soft sunset, the whole village regrouped by the little canal for a small ceremony called the New Water Feast. The elder brought out a clay jar of the season's first floodwater, invited everyone to taste its lightly salty silt, then raised his cup with a gentle clatter. This cup holds the silt of life, that these peanuts may grow strong. His words reminded all to give thanks to the water, for it granted them both fertility and life. Then, as darkness fell, torches were lit along the canal bank, their flames dancing on the water's surface. The villagers formed a circle, closed their eyes and prayed that the flood wouldn't run too high, that the young vines would not be crushed, and for a truly abundant autumn. Their springtime lullaby rose in even cadence, promising that however fierce the storms or floods, so long as they stood together, nurturing and believing, the peanut plants would push upward, bloom, and bear sweet fruit at harvest. Did you know that even in a tightly knit community, disagreements can sprout like weeds across the fields? As the peanut crop took firm root, Klaus village split over how to use the remaining land. One faction argued for expanding sweet potato beds to bolster winter reserves. The other opposed, insisting peanuts were the primary protein source and should not yield ground to another crop. One afternoon, after the New Water Feast, the young men gathered before the village hall for a heated debate. Hans, Jakob's son, declared, "We need sweet potatoes for hot meals. Surely we can't rely forever on dried peanuts." Meanwhile, Marcellus, owner of the best peanut plots, nodded and countered, "Peanuts supply protein. Sweet potatoes only starch. Without enough protein, our smoked meats will be shriveled this winter." Some listened with stern faces, recalling that this year's peanut yield promised plenty to trade at market for warm cloth and lamp oil. The opposing camp worried, if we sell too soon, who will save seed for next season? Marta, head of irrigation, gently interjected, "We need an unspoken agreement. No more than 1/3 of our reserve may be sold. The rest stays locked beneath the granary floor. under our collective responsibility. It wasn't just the crops that split them. The question of reinforcing the dike stakes was also contentious. One group wanted to pile on large stones to resist strong floods. Others feared this would starve the village well by cutting off the groundwater. When the sound of hose striking the embankment rang out, you could hear tense whispers. If the water table drops, we'll have to trek farther for water. Amid these disputes, the elder stepped forward. Let us listen to both reason and our ancestors' wisdom. Each proposal has merit. To reach unity, let us trial each measure on a small scale. Expand the sweet potato patch by a narrow strip, reinforce one section of the dike, then observe the results before scaling up. The village fell silent, save for the spring breeze rustling through the bamboo grove. In that moment, you could see that despite their arguments, everyone's heart was fixed on a single goal: ensuring survival for the coming winter. It is from these very disagreements, and the ways they resolve them, that the strength of the community grows ever firmer. When you're ready, we will continue with part 2 of this chapter, the story of how the villagers find common ground and heal their divisions to forge a perfect autumn harvest. The debate at the village hall still simmered as autumn dusk settled. Someone spoke up that the newly built cowshed beside the grain store should be moved to prevent damp odours. Another argued that the cow's body warmth was precisely what kept the granary from freezing. In a corner of the yard, 2 elders, faces flushed, voiced opposing views. One insisted, "We cannot abandon the cows in the shelter that has stood against wind and rain for years," while the other quavered, "If the cowshed collapses onto the granary, all our saved seed will mould overnight." Meanwhile, the carpenters argued over what wood to use in place of scarce elm. One favoured inexpensive pine for the defensive fence. Another worried it wouldn't withstand blizzards. A young man offered a compromise. Why not laminate the 2 woods and combine their strengths? But he was immediately rebuffed. Laminating wood is a city dweller's trick. We're not professional joiners. Even the guard rotations were disputed. One faction proposed adding an extra watch at dusk, when wolves most often roamed. The others countered that the air then was still warm, and would be better used fetching water and splitting wood. Their heated words echoed across the hall square, drawing curious gazes from children at the gate, eyes bright with confusion, longing to understand but not yet able to judge right from wrong. As the argument peaked, Marta looked up and spoke in a steady voice. "We cannot insist on our own will alone. Let's trial this for 1 week, observe the wolves' frequency, then adjust. Even the best laid plans must evolve over time." Her words cut through the arguments like a sharp blade, but were immediately met with a fresh complaint. 1 week won't suffice. If wolves strike tomorrow, who will answer for it? In another corner, the debate over smoked pork fat reserves ignited. One side argued for equal shares for every household. The other insisted that those who butchered more pigs deserved more lard. Someone suggested a communal fund. But this idea was promptly denounced as socialist, alien to the ancestors' customs. The disputes dragged on until night fell, torchlight before the hall flickering in the wind. The steady rap of knuckles on the wooden table sounded like a reminder. The community's heart still beat, even if their disagreements had not yet closed. All understood that these conflicts signalled their entry into a new phase, one that would test their trust, their ability to listen, and their capacity to find a shared path before the true chill of winter set in. And from these very divisions, the real strength of Klaus Village would soon be revealed. Can you feel it? As the autumn wind turns as sharp as a knife, so too do the villagers' hearts split in two. Once, no matter how heated the debates, they still shared a common purpose. But now disagreements have piled up beyond repair. One morning after the watch bell rang, Jakob and Marcellus met by the irrigation channel leading to the fields. Their eyes no longer harmonised as before. Hints of reproach and resentment flickered behind every greeting. Marta, heeding the elders' advice, summoned an urgent meeting before the village hall. 2 opposing rows of benches were set. On one side stood the Protect the Peanuts faction, led by Marcellus. On the other, the Expand sweet potatoes and turnips faction, under Hans's leadership. Each presentation grew more heated. When Marcellus warned, "If we only focus on potatoes, in the dead of winter we'll lose our protein source and freeze to death," Hans retorted, "And if we only care for peanuts, when the cold parches us and we lack firewood, we'll freeze to death just the same." The hall rocked when some old-line families quietly dragged cows' yokes and hunting muskets toward the potato beds in silent protest. The opposing side retaliated by cutting off several water channels feeding the peanut plots, forcing water to flow into the sweet potato furrows. The roar of water through the peanut trenches rang like a silent declaration of war. Imagine bundles of firewood piled in the village yard, split into 2 heaps and each marked with the faction's name. Beneath one heap, someone scrawled in charcoal, "Don't burn this wood, let the peanuts freeze." Beneath the other, "Potatoes won't survive the snow." The flicker of torchlight over the piles felt like a jealous glare between those who had once shouldered the winter's frost together. The air grew stifling as night fell. Jabs and jeers wove into every puff of hearth smoke. Hans and a few young men tore down a section of the thorn fence in the yard, treating it as an ultimatum. Unless the other side yielded, the barrier would remain broken. Enraged, Marcellus led a group of women to destroy several potato sheds, where they'd been storing pickled bamboo shoots and peanut seed, leaving behind a cold message. Save the peanuts first, then worry about the roots. That night, the 2 factions set up separate quarters. On the left, a row of green-painted doors for the peanut supporters. On the right, red-painted doors for the potato supporters. Even the school children lined up in 2 ranks. The division seemed etched into every brick and wooden beam. The communal hearth by the hall was padlocked. The half-lit watchfire only served to signal alarms. No one dared rekindle it for a shared pot of porridge. Friend, perhaps the most painful thing was not the dispute itself, but how "peace be with you" turned into "beware my house." Dogs barked angrily through the night, awakening solitude. In every home, each family now hoarded supplies alone. No one shared a seat along the fence, nor heard neighbours' laughter like before. Thus the invisible wall between the factions left deep scars. Colder fires, more muffled waters, and a loneliness creeping through the winter's approach. Breathe in the tang of that flickering thorn smoke, and remember that this is the height of discord. An ordeal of trust and fellowship, no less fierce than blizzards or the plague. Only when they realise the enormity of their loss will there be hope to mend the old bonds and return to a once warmed common hearth. Can you feel the deep chill seeping through every crack in the door, down into the packed earth floor whenever you step outside? That is when the division, once just a minor dispute, became a gulf that left all of Klaus village worse off than ever, helpless against the frost that was consuming lives. From now on, each family would struggle alone against blizzards, wild beasts and hunger, without the warm shoulder of a neighbour to lean on. Let me tell you the story of that final winter, when the bonds of neighbourliness seemed lost, and every household had to muster the strength to face the hardship alone. Each morning, the village no longer echoed with the patter of children dashing into the square. Instead, the only sound was the wind rattling the thorn fence, as if whispering, "Trust no one but yourself." The row of peanut supporters quietly swept snow into the corners and slammed their doors shut. Across the way, the sweet potato faction did the same, leaving only a sliver of weak light through shutter gaps, making the interiors dark and oppressive. A few families still tried to call a meeting at the hall, but as soon as they reached the threshold, they found apathy. The old elder, now feeble, slumped in his chair with his back turned. The second elder merely shook his head and closed his woven mat, letting their invitation fall to the cold floor. Everyone reminded one another, "We argued so fiercely we wouldn't speak. How can we heal now?" Then the blizzard struck without warning, and many households discovered their food stores were insufficient. In Schmidt's cupboard, he'd championed expanding sweet potatoes. There remained only a jar of salted peanuts, a few shriveled tubers, and a single small pouch of salt. Conversely, Leclerc, the peanut advocate, had sold most of his seeds to buy warmer cloth and now had only last summer's sweet potatoes to eat. Each side craved what the other still possessed, yet pride barred them from seeking help. Late that night, in the howling wind, Jakob, now living proof of their division, knocked quietly on the door opposite. He sighed as he peered through the window. Marta slowly pulled her wool blanket aside, her eyes heavy with fatigue. "We have failed," he whispered. Marta said nothing, but stepped to the door and cracked it open. Through the gap, Jakob slipped in a small wooden box holding a handful of salted turnips and a pinch of smoked pork, his last reserves. Marta caught it gratefully, tears in her eyes. "If we don't help one another, the whole village will freeze." But their furtive footsteps did not go unheard. A few ever-wary families bolted their shutters at the sound. Torches flared, casting a harsh red light over the tense faces of the guards. They drew their spears, shouting, "Bandit! Traitor!" Jakob raised his hands. "Not a bandit." I brought Marta some food. Yet division had dug deep into their hearts. His explanation was dismissed as a trick, proof of siding, with one faction that once tore the village apart. By dawn, the storm had eased enough to reveal drifts nearly knee-high. Each household had to shovel snow from their own doorways, for there was no one else to ask. The peanut supporters watched helplessly as wind-tossed thorn fences lay flattened. The potato faction awoke to find their thatch roof collapsed onto their firewood stack. No one dared lend rope or stakes to reinforce them, for fear of losing our potatoes or peanuts. In the nights that followed, many families camped out in their own granaries, huddled around meagre jars of corn, fiercely guarding each small peanut under its linen wrap. They sat in silence, listening to the brittle rustle of straw as the children shivered in their hay beds, a mournful, wordless lullaby. Outside, the winds howl through the bare branches threatened. Without unity, none will remain. They lacked not only food, but also hope. The alarm bell no longer rang for guard duty. Both sides had abandoned the watches, each fearing intruders would invade their own territory. Wolves took advantage of the emptiness, slipping silently to the unguarded cattle pens. The Vogel family awoke to find a third of their lambs missing, and blamed the sweet potato faction for breaking their promise to share firewood for the night watch. Rumour said the peanut faction had refused to bring spare wood when warned of wolves, and were now treated as enemies, shunned entirely. The small winter fair ceremony, when once everyone gathered around the communal fire to offer incense to the earth god, failed that year. There was only meagre kindling left. The torch was nothing but a flicker. People stood apart, too afraid to sing the old harvest hymn together. The children were silent, their sobs choked by loneliness. The elder closed his eyes, dropped the incense stick into the glowing coals, and turned away in silence. Perhaps the clearest sign of the village's shared sorrow. When division peaked, even the rituals meant to unite their spirits could not take place. That, my friend, was the climax of discord, when each household became a lonely island, buried beneath the frost with no help to hope for. Grief piled on hardship. No food, no firewood. Wolves roaming free. And worst of all, no trust. Even a thorn fence felt like a brick wall between them. In that bitter cold, they had to fight alone, endure alone. And it was their failure to stand together that made the frozen trials infinitely harsher. After the darkest peak of division, the flame of hope seemed all but extinguished. Yet as the blizzard still raged in swirling layers, they rediscovered a simple truth. Only by standing shoulder to shoulder could they withstand the merciless cold. And it was at that moment that those who had stood at opposite ends of the conflict began tentatively shifting foot by foot toward one another, groping to find shared empathy again. Every new beginning sprang from a single knock at the door. One night, after the storm had momentarily eased, Jakob crept to the sweet potato faction's house and slipped a still warm millet cake through the crack with a note. "Sharing now so we can keep warm together tomorrow." Marta saw it, nodded slightly, and returned the gesture by sending 2 rolls of thick linen for the children's blankets. That small act blew a fresh wind of reconnection through the village. Next, the leaders of both factions held a secret meeting in the old grain barn, an unexpected venue. They laid out the wooden box of peanut seed and the leather pouch of dried tubers and agreed on a 1/3 surplus split 3 ways plan. Each family would set aside a small portion to bring to the village hall to keep the communal fire alive and serve as an emergency reserve. Determined whispers replaced the harsh criticisms of old. Even the children became bridges. They traded warmth maps, patches of knitted wool each household had donated, to assemble a large blanket that would be placed at each door in rotation. Every week it moved to whoever needed it most, a promise in thread and stitch. We will not abandon anyone. This practice brought cheerful commotion to the lanes, as villagers saw the harvest's colours woven into every length of yarn. They didn't just share goods, they shared knowledge. Marta and the herbalists invited the sweet potato mothers into the apothecary barn to teach them the recipes for diluted guava and mugwort teas. In return, the peanut faction revealed their secret for an undying flame, using dried waterweed soaked in flaxseed oil, ensuring their neighbours always had a steady glow without worrying over oil supplies. The night watch was re-established too. The 2 factions combined into 3 rotating squads, 1 peanut, 1 potato, and 1 mixed youth patrol, to increase mutual oversight. After dusk, the alarm bell rang reliably, no longer distinguishing peanut yard from potato yard. By the communal torchlight, they shared for the first time the story of their great rift, admitted their mistakes, and vowed never again to let darkness divide them. Children's giggles blended with the elders' warm chatter by the hearth, weaving a new anthem of compassion. In the following days, firewood was collected together, irrigation channels were reopened, and both barns and dikes were reinforced by collective effort. And when winter, though not yet over, swept in, another storm, Klaus village was no longer alone. They divided every sweet potato, handful of peanuts, every glowing ember, and every warm swathe of cloth, sharing words of encouragement. Together we will see the dawn. In that long, bitter night, it was those small acts of sharing that wrought the miracle of unity, warming every heart. And so at last the final bitter nights began to recede, yielding to dawn's first light over the snow-capped peaks. The farming community of Klaus, once plunged into the depths of division and despair, had rediscovered their shared heartbeat of neighbourly care. They gathered once more around the warming blaze in the village square, eyes bright with renewed hope, closing a long and arduous chapter. Let us first recall the severe trials they overcame. 1. Bitter cold and blizzards. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Snowdrifts smothered their hearths, and hidden thin ice threatened every step. They mastered the undying flame, staked ember beds of ash around each home, and kept rotating watch shifts by the stove to guard against frost. 2. Starvation and food shortages. The Great Famine of 1315, prolonged drought, and failed harvests shrank their granaries. They survived on thin corn soup, shared each small bowl of porridge, and developed methods to salt, smoke, and dry turnips for winter reserves. 3. Wild beasts and wolf packs. Nightly wolf hunts encircled their village, and hungry bears raided their stalls. They constructed thorn fences, forged sharpened iron spears, burned pungent guava ash to drive off predators, organised rotating sentries, and invented early warning bells. 4. The plague, the Black Death. Rumours of whooping cough and plague spread door to door. They turned to herbal remedies, apple vinegar teas, mugwort wraps, and makeshift isolation tents with smoke and vinegar bowls at the entrance. 5. Raiders and harsh tax collectors. Rogue soldiers plundered livestock and grain. The magistrates' officers demanded black taxes. Villagers countered with the phantom granary ruse, shared small rations for negotiation leverage, and formed a civic council to bargain for fairer levies and firewood. 6. Internal conflict and self-reliance. Disputes between the peanut and sweet potato factions once snuffed out their fires and choked their irrigation channels. Division turned each household into a lonely island, fending for itself against snow, wolves, and hunger, until they realised how much they had lost. Yet in the end, when adversity pushed them to the brink, their spirit of solidarity saved them. They learned to share material goods, millet cakes, sweet potatoes, glowing embers and handfuls of peanuts. Share knowledge, recipes for guava mugwort teas, the secret of the undying flame, pest control tricks and safe ice markers. Share labour, organise firewood crews, irrigation teams, herbalist circles, guard patrols, and dike reinforcement squads. Share rituals, rotating community blankets, the new water feast, the fields of gold harvest hymn, and joint prayers. They turned fear into action and division into cooperation, weaving a survival network stronger than any wooden wall. And when the snows thawed and wildflowers unfurled across the new silt fields, they understood that nature's harsh trials were but a test, while the true miracle lay in the united hearts of its people. Let this story remain in your heart as an undying testament. However poor or deprived the Middle Ages may have been, with neighbourly solidarity, they always found a way to confront and conquer. Dawn has come, and the village of Klaus, from its warm embers to the children's joyful laughter, is ready to step into a new spring, brimming with hope and confidence in tomorrow's promise.